Good evening and welcome to the greatest history never told. And you can forget your Netflix and all the other stuff. This kind of docu-interview, this historical drama, if you will, is an absolutely fascinating story. And it will explain all of what's happening in the world today that is often seemingly inexplicable. And trust me on this, you're going to enjoy this. I'm joined with Dr. Jakob Nordangard, who is a double MA and a PhD, and he has done all the work over a decade, and you will see he has many books on this fully referenced. But this is the true history of the world, the most relevant history, which has led us to the world that we now inhabit. And this will help you and your family to much more fully understand all of the vectors and things that are going on in the world, many of which you may be unhappy with, but at least now you will fully understand where they all come from. So you can do questions on the side panel. Myself and Dr. Nordangard will answer them all during this feature-length docudrama, if you will. So enjoy. Hey all, I'm just about to start a fascinating series of interviews which looks at the history of all the big foundations and the NGOs that have led us to the place we are now in the 20s, or 2020s that is, with our freedoms and our future under significant question. So Dr. Jakob Nordangard,
yeah,
delighted to meet you in person here in Stockholm.
Yeah.
And you have done all the work from the published references, published newspaper articles, books, and the Rockefeller Institute's own archives. So I want to reassure people that everything we'll discuss is all published. There's no conspiracy theory, but it's a fascinating history, and I think it's very relevant to how we kind of counter the current movements that threaten our futures, really. So I thought we'd start with a segment around 20 minutes maybe on what a lot of people asked about, and that was the history before the 1950s, because the 1950s, the foundation of Rockefeller and others really got going. But there's a history that goes back to the late 1800s. So we might treat that first phase of, you might say, malign influence on the world.
I mean, if we go back to the late 19th century, we have the big industrialists that shaped that area. Especially if you talk about the Rockefellers, of course, and John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller, he became the richest man in the world. He started the Standard Oil Corporation in 1870. He also wanted to influence the world and his country, United States, through the use of philanthropy. And he started early with philanthropic endeavors, and it became very strategic. It was not, and it was very smart. It's a smart move to start with philanthropy, because in that way you could avoid taxation, and instead you gave to the society an exchange. But what you gave to society would benefit your business, and that was always the plan and the idea. And this was it started early on with financing the universities, and he actually founded the University of Chicago and and also the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research. And these institutions was very influential in setting the research agenda at the time, and research that naturally would benefit the business for the Rockefeller network. Early in the I think it was 1913, he set up a foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. And it was at the same time because also Andrew Carnegie, he was into the steel industry. He also became very, very rich. So Rockefeller and Carnegie, they set up the first the real foundations, the modern version of foundations. And the Carnegie Foundation was a bit early than the Rockefeller. the idea was to have this money and make it work for, one can say, a new order of the world that was meant to be built on management philosophy. Because they thought the government of the day was not efficient; it was inefficient. So they thought it's better for us to influence the politics and direct it in a more international, because that's a very important thing with the foundation of their work. They were from the beginning internationalists. It was an internationalist cause, and that wasn't just to create this good world where we would have a big human family and all these buzzwords, but it was more about business. Because one thing was that the Standard Oil Corporation in the late 19th century, they were kind of hated because they were ruthless, and it was all about creating monopolies and a big oil monopoly. And they had problems with doing business with, other countries. They could have legislation and things that were problematic for them, and they had to negotiate with every country. And they had the same problem in the United States. They had to negotiate with every state. And so one thing, they wanted to have the federal laws that they could influence, and so that they could didn't have to negotiate with each one. And they wanted to do this on an international level as well. So that's why they one of the big things for them was both the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. It was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was so they were working very much behind the scenes with creating the League of Nations. And together with, we have some influential think tanks like the Royal Institute of International Affairs in Great Britain, and also the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. And they were very influential in funding these institutions that were working to more or less create this new organization for the world, and that was the League of Nations at that time.
So essentially, put simply, the biggest, most powerful families had all the money they could ever desire in the early 1900s, the Carnegies and Rockefeller, but they simply wanted much more money, and certainly more power and influence and control, and perceived themselves as the right ones, the smartest guys in the room maybe, who needed to step in and manage the planet, because the existing politicians and ordinary people, let's be honest, they can't manage themselves. They're not like us.
Yeah.
So, and I remember, particularly for my audience, they'll be interested, many will be aware that Rockefeller, and you mentioned it, took over the world of medicine, created universities, and he drove a relentless pursuit to turn medicine into a highly profitable business. And what he did essentially was he attacked all forms of natural medicine and all competitors to the pharmaceutical underpinned medicine that we have today. So people need to realize this guy has been enormously successful. There's no conspiracy theory, but he has taken over medicine, and he knew it was a 100-year plan that would go on after his death. And he wanted to take over, in some sense, the world. But as you pointed out, Jakob, they didn't perceive themselves as evil. They really did perceive themselves as the ones to join hands with other ultra-wealthy around the world and basically manage the world.
Yes, yeah. They saw them as better than ordinary people. They are the smart ones. And why would they let the dumb people rule the world?
And sadly,
yeah,
for the audience, sadly, that's all of us. It's the 99.9%.
Yeah,
let's be honest. And you could even argue, and I often said this on COVID debacle, you could argue, and I wouldn't, that maybe it's better to have elites managing the West and avoiding long-term a real war with China. It could be better for us to never have a real war with China, but we would have QR codes dystopia, but we'd be safe. So you can argue for their view, but I think obviously it's dystopian and horrifying, but I can see why some people might even defend these views. But you know what? That's the late 19th century. Is there much more up until the 40s and 50s where we'll kick off the second segment, where Rockefeller really gets into pandemics and climate?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course. I mean, this foundation, it led to the League of Nations, and then they had something to work with. So they were very influential in setting up the precursor of the WHO. The Rockefeller Foundation was kind of, they were doing the job, and also what the League of Nations, it led eventually to the setup of the United Nations, and that's very important. And then you come to the WHO, and the Rockefeller Foundation was very influential in setting up that as well. So if you look into the history, you always find the Rockefeller Foundation, especially in health at that time.
Yeah, you know, people call something a conspiracy theory, and in the last 30 or 40 years, conspiracy theory has been created as a very powerful weapon against critical thought, against investigative journalism, against local communities and nationalism biased people. They get called extreme right conspiracy theorists. So it's a very powerful weapon, like anti-vax has been groomed and grown as a powerful propaganda weapon against anyone who questions. But the reality is, from the historical record, that what sounds like a conspiracy theory, i.e. Rockefeller running the world, kind of. The Rockefeller Foundation has been massively, by the Pareto principle, is massively the driver of a lot of our modern ills. Are there other similar foundations that share this, or is it is primarily Rockefeller that set this train?
It was at the beginning very much, and we had, as I mentioned, the Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, and this is the Carnegie Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and that is actually more about war, but it was those in the beginning because they were the richest at that time. And in the 30s, we had another big foundation coming in, and it was the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation has been very, very influential, especially from the 50s and 60s. But they have worked in tandem with the Rockefeller Foundation, because they do. And actually, the Ford Foundation, they have all their papers are archived at the Rockefeller archives. So it's very, very connected to each other, and they also shared a lot of, board members and so on. So very much working together for this internationalist cause.
Right, and then so we have Carnegie, Rockefeller, of course, which is kind of the quarterback, the heavy player, the Ford Foundation, and actually it just brings to mind, there was a railroad barons as well back in the day, because Carnegie were steel. Maybe it was Carnegie.
Vanderbilts. Was it Vanderbilts that were into the rail? Yeah,
True. Did the Vanderbilts get involved in this ultra-rich club to run the world?
I mean, they were a part of it at that time. So, of course, I mean, it's a little club with influential people and.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, and as we know now today, especially since COVID, I think it became came to many more people awareness that there is something running the show. It's just people are not sure what, and these series of interviews are going to explain the full history. So will we say much more up until the 1950s when, as you say, Ford began to get more involved? Rockefeller was kicking off the brainstorming, the whiteboard of pandemics and climate and financial.
Yeah. Because one thing that was important in the 40s, it was the setup of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Because first we had the Rockefeller Foundation, and that was John D. Rockefeller Senior and Junior, and then in 1940 the grandchildren to John D. Rockefeller, the brothers, right. And I mean it was sons to John D. Rockefeller Jr. 5 sons, but at the time was the richest in the world, and I mean set up during the Second World War, and at the end of the war, when the United States was one of the victors, they could influence a lot of things, and also set up. I mean, was very involved in setting up the United Nations.
And I think you mentioned in our other interview that the Rockefellers essentially saw, and I think it was your phrase, the United Nations as their own private club. Largely, they had this
idea, especially, I mean, Nelson Rockefeller, what was later the Vice President of the United States, and so they were very involved in politics as well. Nelson was a politician. And banking. David Rockefeller was, he became the head of Chase Manhattan Bank.
That
was very, very, very big. So they had a lot of power. And John D. Rockefeller III, he was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation. But they also, when the Rockefeller Foundation, they worked very much with research, universities, and influencing that way, and the education system, and it's a lot of money that they put into that. But the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, they did something else. They were more into, changing, policy, and they were giving money to activist groups to influence, opinion, and that was the big thing with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and in the 50s they got money from Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Standard Oil money that went into something was called the Special Project.
And that's from Rockefeller Brothers Fund.
Yeah, that's the
Special Project.
The Special Project. And that kicked, that really started. Before, it was more like in the 40s, they were learning the art of philanthropy in the beginning. And then in the 50s, they were, okay, now they were old enough, experienced enough to start to do something.
So in the 50s, the philanthropy as a strategy to kind of essentially take over the running of the world, to manage it from the people who know best. In the 50s then it became more philanthropy as an execution tool. A very active tool to target activists, promote activists, start changing policy, move beyond just educating people towards their vision.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, we might, at this point then, move into this 1950s onwards, where, fascinatingly, the climate change concept of a catastrophe first arose in the absence of any scientists by the oil bed. So we might go, do you think it's point to get into that now?
Yeah.
Very good. Hey all, we're going to get into the second segment of the history that has dictated all of our recent experiences in COVID and what's happening in the world. And I think Dr. Nordangard, we had finished off kind of going through the early 20th century and the origins of Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford Foundation, and all these people who made these philanthropic think tanks and foundations, which it turns out were successful over 100 years in coming to this point where they're kind of running the world. But one thing I forgot to mention in the first segment was there's a 1900s newspaper cartoon showing Rockefeller fiddling with the Congress and the US government in his palm. And the media was actually calling out that this guy's dangerous. This rich guy, this kind of bad guy, is basically running the government. It was Rockefeller running the government was the caption. So it was known in the media back then, and the media was warning people, you know, this guy is kind of running government here, or he's trying to.
Yeah, they started very early on. And I mean, this wasn't, it was a lot of newspapers that wrote about the Rockefellers at that time, and also this type of cartoons. And we also have Ida Tarbell that wrote a long article series about how the Standard Oil Corporation ruined her father's business, and then a lot of other that didn't want to comply to the Rockefeller empire. So it was kind of an outrage at the time against the rich industrialists and how they conducted business, and wanted to take over everything.
Yeah, and I also recall that, and I think you have the name of the person, Rockefeller basically ended up getting a PR type person, and then was seen videoed, with black and white of course, giving nickels to kids, like complete, utterly ludicrous stuff, but it actually worked. He's giving nickels to poor kids, and journalists are covering it, and he basically redid his image, a bit like Gates in the 2000s with the jumpers. It worked.
Yeah, and it was, I mean, it was very strategic. Because, it doesn't feel good when people write bad about you. So how do you do? They went to Ivor Lee, a PR expert, and asked for advice. And this was after the Ludlow massacre as well, that the Rockefellers were involved in. It was a sort of a mine in Colorado, I think it was. And people were killed in an incident when there was a strike, and it was a big thing. And media was there and writing about it, and people were upset and demanding that put an end on this with the Rockefeller influence. So what could they do? They talked to Ivor Lee, and Ivor Lee, he said, okay, we have to change the image. And one thing was the dimes, of course. Another thing was you have to influence the media. If media writes bad about you, well, it's better to control the media. It's better that you buy some important newspapers and magazines. And afterwards we have, they have been involved with Time, Life, and a couple others, big magazines, and so in that way they could influence opinion. And I believe he also said another thing: you can't. The thing is that the public, we will find out if you have lied. Lies, you can't lie. You have to tell the truth. I mean, and that was, of course, very, for the Rockefellers,
Anathema.
Yeah, exactly. John D. Rockefeller's father, he was very well known. He was a fraudster, a charlatan, selling snake oil. So they had done these things before. So how do they do it? How can we? The public will find out. Okay, how can we do? We have to take control of the truth. We have to define what truth is, and that's and after that they financed education, research, and the news and everything. So they could create the perception of truth.
Yeah,
it wasn't real truth, but if they say it's true, it is true.
And I think, Jakob, this is just, the parallels with today are screaming, obviously, in my brain, and for anyone watching. Reuters fact-checking. All the fact-checking corporations and companies that are now being funded by the same kind of bad actors to create truth. And it's so Orwellian, but it's business.
Yeah, it
business.
is. And the thing you mentioned, Bill Gates. What happened in the, Microsoft, Bill Gates, and it was this thing, he was in the court because he wanted a monopoly, of course, just like the Rockefellers. and he wasn't popular. He was very unpopular at the time. A lousy Windows operation system as well. And so how do you change the image? Okay, so how did the Rockefellers do? That was his thought, and so they gave advice.
Good advice.
Yeah, on how to do it. And he said that I wanted to modeled after the Rockefeller Foundation.
And he had connections directly, I think, with Rockefellers personally.
Yeah.
So he got the advice. So then we saw, basically he was brought to the Supreme Court of America and lost. They went after him on monopoly and basically megalomania that had gone so far that even in corrupt America it couldn't be accepted.
Yeah.
And one guy joked, and it's so true, the day after he lost in the Supreme Court, and people may have seen the footage of him nodding in a kind of a somewhat on the spectrum way during
exactly.
So you're talking about a really, really clearly, I've managed people for 20 years, and I can tell when someone is a really, really bad person. Just watch their behavior.
Yeah.
But the next morning, as one person joked, he woke up suddenly the next morning after being thrown out for megalomania, and we saw the footage, and he suddenly woke up and he suddenly cared about black babies in Africa. And it's like, how stupid you have to be. But of course, that wasn't the way it was portrayed. He got put in jumpers. He probably did enormous amounts of work with PR type people. He probably had to do tons of mock interviews to kind of pretend to be human. And you can see all this hand waving is a way that he somehow manages to portray this nice person image. But he has to wave his hands because it goes against his nature.
Exactly.
But I have people,
and then he got involved with Jeffrey Epstein.
Come on.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I have people at assistant or even professor level, when I've raised this, and you can see the internal struggle because of the propaganda of the last 20 years. And they say, but, he's done so much to help Africa. You just think, come on. How? But the propaganda, indoctrination of the people, even professors, especially professors in academia.
Especially, yeah.
That's
of
who
course.
you want.
And they got funding, and that's a good motivation to just keep quiet and accept.
And even cognitive dissonance, to tell yourself internally that no, these people are good. Because you don't want to say, well, okay, they're bad, but I'm getting money. Doesn't feel good. So what do human psychology do? You convince yourself, no, it is good. I am working for good people. I am. That's what we say in our heads. So, that will bring us on, though, very nicely. We jumped way ahead there to the 2000s. But just to go back to the storyline, we have the Rockefeller Brothers Fund then is set up in the 40s to not only do the philanthropy, to purchase education, to take over the medical system, and a load of other nasty stuff. But the Brothers Fund is now going to start funding activists and start trying to change actual policy. So that's an interesting point to jump into. And that kind of is where climate and other things start coming up in a bigger way.
Yeah. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund was set up in 1940 by the Rockefeller Brothers, of course. And that was, it's the grandsons to John D. Rockefeller Senior and the sons to Junior. And they were, the richest and most spoiled people at that time.
He had five sons. Everything. 5 sons he had.
5 sons and 1 daughter. And they became very, 4 of them became very influential in their fields. We had the oldest one, John D. Rockefeller III. He was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation, philanthropy. And we had Nelson Rockefeller. He became the vice president of the United States, politician. And also Lawrence Rockefeller, he was very big into environmental matters. And David Rockefeller, the banker. We had a 5th brother, Winthrop. He was also a politician, but he was not that involved, but the others were. Because they had a lot of money, and the richest family after the Second World War had ended. And they had just helped create the United Nations, and also donated the land for building the headquarters in New York City. It was John D. Rockefeller the Junior that gave the money, and Nelson Rockefeller, he made it work in the political area to get it. And with all that money, they wanted to influence, get influence in the world, and make United Nations to this more or less their own organization for managing the world. And in the 50s, this Rockefeller Brothers Fund received money, a lot of money from their father, Junior, and it was for a project, something that they refer to as the special project. And this eventually led to a commission called, it was the Rockefeller panels. So it's called the Rockefeller Panel Reports, the Special Studies Project. And they contacted a lot of influential people, very bright people in every area that you could think of. And they started to discuss how they could more or less create a new order, new world order. They actually say this, new world order. It's our historical mission to bring this about, and a new world order in all its dimensions, economic, political, and cultural, and so on. So in order to bring this about, we need to focus on some problems, problems that are global in scope and needs global cooperation to solve. So they talked about science. In science, we have cooperation. Researchers working with other researchers in other regions of the world to solve problems and so on. And I mean, just before we had this Manhattan Project with the atomic bomb, and also all these projects, and so they saw it was useful to use science. And they said we have 2 areas in science very important, and that is global health and pandemics, because pandemics and epidemics, they go over borders. And that needs an international management. And also oceanography and meteorology, because that's about the atmosphere, and that spans all over the globe. And that also needs management so that these problems that are in with the climate, it can't be solved by one nation. We need this. So they defined these problems in the 50s, and after that they started to work with them very much. And climate is it's in the 50s.
Yeah. And that was fascinating when I saw your talk first, because I'm aware of a lot of the corruption, broadly, obviously, but I did not realize the origins of climate fear, because it is a fear kind of creation, a vehicle, a tool, a strategy. Clearly, it originated with these guys without a single scientist in the room, on a whiteboard in a corporate-style room, in a geopolitical new order powerhouse. That's where it originated. So people should realize that whatever your belief on CO2 now at 0.04% in the atmosphere, and it was at 0.03, and it never correlated in the past with temperature changes, which have been huge, but whatever your opinion on any of the science, it originated with these guys and along with pandemics. And that's fascinating, Jakob. They identified things that could be justified as requiring global control. Because they're global. Because they knew there's no point worrying about some coal mining problem, because maybe that's occurring in Manchester. We don't care about Manchester. We want an excuse to take global control. Therefore, they've picked the meteorology, the climate, and the pandemic, health. But also the beauty of those two things is they're perfect to make a global fear narrative. And I think you said, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is the Rockefellers taking all the money from the mothership, they splintered off to actually fund activists and try and change policy. And some of the activists they were funding was linked to the Club of Rome, Rich Boys Climate Club, and you know, this is where the whole climate thing kind of grew from the 50s. We just run through Club of Rome, I guess. Don't think we went into detail of the Italian billionaire. And
the thing is, in 1952, they have a meeting about population. The Population Council comes out of that, and that's John D. Rockefeller III. At that meeting about population, the problem with population, they have a meteorologist, oceanograph at that meeting. He's called Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle is referred as the grandfather of the global warming, the modern global warming movement among scientists. And after that, we come to the 60s, because Roger Revelle and also a Swedish meteorologist called Carl Gustav Rossby, they become very involved in talking about this and say that this is a problem, we have to investigate it. And they do this in the 50s. So Roger Revelle sets up, they start measurements on Hawaii, Mauna Loa. And they have this very cooperation with, and this is the international networks, the cooperation with Stockholm. Carl Gustav Rossby, he has been at the Stockholm University. He goes to the United States, and he starts to work for the Rockefellers at the Woods Hole, and also the University of Chicago. And the interesting thing is, when Carl Gustav Rossby dies, because he is very influential in setting up this in Stockholm, there's a book that is published about him and what he has done for climate research. And it's published by the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research. Why? Because they were so involved with each other. And I read about it when I was writing this book, Rockefeller Controlling the Game. It's all about the climate.
And by the way, just for people, I'll put the link down below, because it's not easy to find the link to order it. but or not totally easy. So I'll put the link down below. And this has basically everything we're talking about in full detail, all historical references, and even tables that show every key figure from the late 1800s right through to 2018. Every figure, and it is just a spaghetti junction of bad guys. Every date, isn't that it? It's
it is. Yeah,
all documented.
Yeah.
No conspiracy theory.
Yeah,
all documented. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but when I was researching this, the science editor at Rockefeller Institute, he has said, "Why do you do this? This has nothing to do with what we are doing here at the Rockefeller Institute. We do medical research." But it was very important to publish this. In the late 50s, I think it came out. And then after that, they had a meeting, a big international meeting, it was the first international conference on global warming. And it was funded by Conservation Foundation. The Conservation Foundation was more or less a Rockefeller institution, with Lawrence Rockefeller involved. I think he was the vice chairman at the time, and that they made a report, but were picked up by President Lyndon Johnson. And also we find both Lawrence Rockefeller and Roger Revelle, they were influencing the policy at the time, advising Lyndon Johnson. So Lyndon Johnson was the first president to talk about global warming in 1965. And that led up to 1968 and the Club of Rome. But they also were involved in funding. The Club of Rome, of course, is one of the most important environmental think tanks in the world. And my background in the environmental movement, their report, The Limits to Growth, it was just like a Bible. But of course, the thing was that the Club of Rome, when I were starting to dig into it and research, I found out that they were, it was powerful people behind it, industrialists, where the head of the first chairman or president of the Club of Rome was Aurelio Peccei, an Italian. He was the second man at Fiat Motor Corporation. And the money that funded Club of Rome in the beginning came from his boss, Giovanni Agnelli, from the Fiat Motor Corporation. And I thought at that time, this is very strange.
Ultra-wealthy industrialists, Machiavellian clearly, and they want to fund something that's going to go against their own business interests.
Yeah, it sounds like,
apparently. And in other words, it just stinks of long game corruption. And he had connections, I think, not only is it coming from the rich industrialist, right, which, as I described just now, but I think he has connections too to Rockefeller.
Giovanni Agnelli. He was a good friend of David Rockefeller. They had a lot of business together, and also Agnelli was a part of Chase Manhattan's international advisory committee or something. I think Kissinger was the head of that at one time. So it's a little club with influential people, and also. One of the founding meetings of Club of Rome was at the Bellagio Center in Italy, that is run by the Rockefeller Foundation. So you find all the time, when I have done this research, you always end there. Always.
Well, you know, Jakob, I'm going to draw this segment to a close, and then we're going to get into Kissinger, Schwab, and move up towards the 2000s, where people will now see in their own lives in the last 20 years, everything that was nuts that was happening, or every scam that you actually may have believed or fell for, you'll actually see where it all came from. So I think that, but the last thing I'll close on is Nick Hudson, a good friend of mine who's super smart, South African guy, actuary, knows the numbers and knows science. But recently a viral clip went out that I helped get out, and it was Nick doing a monologue. He's extremely articulate and he can just, you know, articulate concepts so well. But he essentially said, and I'm going to paraphrase it, he says, if you see anything coming out that's apparently a global problem that we all together need to address, but the only permissible solution is a global one, and will involve handing more power or authority to global organizations. And he said, add in, if dissent is in any way crushed or pushed against, and censorship in any way, or there's a static idea of the science and a consensus claimed, right? A static, which is not science, it's the opposite of science. Exactly. Science is always debating. If those things, and he might have mentioned one or two or more criteria, come together, he said, you do not need to look at the modeling, and it'll usually be modeling that's causing this. You don't need to look at the math. You don't need to look at the science, right? You know it's a scam if those conditions are met. Yeah. You don't need to look at any science. And you know what, Jakob, we're obviously going through many examples and we'll go through more. I thought he was being a bit strong, but I went through the criteria and it's actually correct. There is no exception. Cholesterol, fat is bad for you. COVID, lockdowns work, climate. Every single thing, if you apply those criteria, it is a scam. And the beauty is, not beauty, the horrific beauty, all of the scams actually go back to the foundations, NGOs and organizations that we're discussing. So we'll pick it up on the next one and we'll move up to the 2000s.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey all, segment 3 of our fascinating discussion with Dr. Nordangard, who has done all the work to sift all the conspiracy theory out and only look at published, documented science and history in his book, link below. And it's just a fascinating story. And I think, Jakob, we were just finishing up there with the creation of the Club of Rome, super rich guys, environmental fear movement, or fomenting of fear, that's the way I view it. Linked in, of course, with the Rockefellers. But probably now is a good time to get into coming into the 50s and 60s and the whole Kissinger and introduction of Klaus Schwab, the mentee, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, Henry Kissinger, he was picked up by the Rockefellers in the 50s. And he had been in intelligence. And he was a part of a report that Council on Foreign Relations was behind in the 50s, and he met David Rockefeller and then also Nelson Rockefeller, and so they saw that this is a guy be very good to deliver things for us.
And he turned out to be, Kissinger, shockingly enormously influential for sure. But just the Council for Foreign Relations, I'm not sure we gave a quick summary of what that is and was.
Council on Foreign Relations is a think tank, American think tank. It was set up in like 1920, 21. And they have been very influential in setting American foreign policy. And before United Nations were created, they set up something that was called the War and Peace Studies, and in that they proposed the Bretton Woods system and also the United Nations. Everything they had discussed and came up with a proposal just before the war about this new organization. So and funded by J.P. Morgan from the beginning, and the Rockefellers, and all these very influential people. It was a sister institution to the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. That's also a very elite think tank. Very, very important for the setup of League of Nations and the United Nations, and working behind the scenes for more or less creating this new world system. So that's what the Council of Foreign Relations have been doing. And David Rockefeller was for a long time chairman of CFR. So Kissinger were part of the report from the Council of Foreign Relations. He meets with the brothers, and Nelson Rockefeller at the time, when he sets up this special studies project, he talks to, he says that I want someone that can be a coordinator of this project. And Kissinger gets the job to do this. Kissinger is also at Harvard University, and he's involved in the program that is fostering new international leaders. In the 60s, Klaus Schwab attended this program. From that time, Kissinger is mentoring Schwab. Schwab then goes back to Switzerland, sets up this foundation that it is, European Management Forum, that later becomes the World Economic Forum. And you also find CIA involved in the background to this program as well.
And yeah, that was fascinating that they've been actively involved. They've been heavily involved in the United Nations as well, and links to even Vatican programs that involve the Vatican and all. I mean, it's like this massive octopus. But Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie, Ford, all the foundations from the early 1900s essentially driving this, creating this superstructure. And then the Rockefeller Brothers Fund spins off with the Rockefeller Brothers and begins to get more involved in United Nations and the kind of the actualizing or the executing on all of the foundation's desires. They get more involved with politicians and placing politicians, which is a real intelligence field to it. So it makes sense CIA is involved. Grooming and then putting politicians in power by opening the right doors or maybe pushing aside the wrong people in their mind. It's all coming together as a kind of a intelligence-like network, not just...
it is.
Yeah, it is.
Of course, yeah.
And Kissinger, of course, is up to his neck in bad actor stuff all over the world. I mean, I heard it said once that he quoted once that this ploy we're now rolling out, one of his many ploys, this one has the advantage that it's kind of actually true. It was almost a bonus that what we want what we want to happen now in the story or narrative we're telling is actually kind of true. Isn't that great for once?
Yeah, I mean, Kissinger, he's a realist.
Yeah.
And he's not much up to, I mean, democracy and stuff. It's not important for him.
No.
He can cooperate with anyone. He has done. And so, I mean, he becomes very important because at the time, from the late 50s, Nelson Rockefeller wants to become the president. It's his main goal, the president of the United States. And this special studies project, I mean, it's a part of his ambitions. And the report is influencing the administrations. First the John F. Kennedy administration, then the Lyndon Johnson administration, then the Nixon Foundation. So you can find a lot of these ideas put into this report that then are executed in the administrations that comes later. And Kissinger is, of course, very important in this. And Kissinger becomes, the Secretary of State to Nixon in the 70s.
And so, and of course, Kissinger was played in that famous film by Peter Sellers, in that satirical film. I forget the name, but it's super famous. He's in a wheelchair in it, and he's kind of like a Nazi. I don't know. I'll put a clip in here. It's so funny.
It's modeled on a couple of characters. It's also molded on Herman Kahn. Yeah.
And President Lyndon Johnson, though, it registers with me. You said something else about Lyndon Johnson became the first president, I think, to introduce climate stuff. But it came from these ultra wealthy guys, right?
Yeah, from the Rockefellers, very much so. So they had the science.
The science.
Yeah.
We need a gong there or some kind of...
So Lyndon Johnson was the first one, and then they introduced it on the international scene. And Kissinger was one of the ones who talked about climate in the 70s and said that we need international cooperation about climate.
And who said that?
Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger was what? Yes.
Yeah, it was. I mean, when he was Secretary of State.
And you know, for people to resonate, the exact same corruption today, because what did the WHO and even the UK health authorities and the British Medical Journal all start screaming since the program really got going in March 2020, okay? They're all screaming about climate.
Yeah.
All of them. They're all together in this, in lockstep.
Yeah.
Just like Rockefeller lockstep 2010.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but we'll go back to Kissinger though, and stay back, moving with Kissinger and Schwab through into the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, the important things that happens during it's a big meeting. We now sit in Stockholm. In 1972, it's a big United Nations meeting in Stockholm. The United Nations Conference on the Environment. And that is a big step in this climate change agenda. And also the Club of Rome, they published this report, the limits to growth, setting the agenda and putting the problem in front of people. And I mean, and it happened a lot of things at that time with the environment, of course, and it was a bad situation with pollution and everything. So they fixed a lot of things, but it was for the better, of course. But they left with in the end, it was only climate change left. But this led eventually in the 80s to the Brundtland Commission. And that's very important because that sets the agenda for our age. The Brundtland Commission, we find Gro Harlem Brundtland, and we find Maurice Strong. Maurice Strong was he was Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference on the Environment, and he was a member of the Club of Rome. And a friend of the Rockefellers, of course. You have to be if you get to these positions. So they take the environmental problems and they put it in the hands of this commission. And their mission is to hammer out a plan for the future, to manage the planet in a sustainable manner. And this leads to the Agenda 21, decided in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro.
Sustainable development goals.
Sustainable development, because that's it comes from this, and it comes from population, the control of population, problems with population, everything that the Rockefellers discussed in the 50s. And also one interesting fact when I was studying the background to the Brundtland Commission report is called Our Common Future. It's always in the names, Our Common Future, Our Common. And
we're all in this together.
We have to solve this problem, this big problem together. and the thing was, and I have this in my book, how the Rockefellers at that time, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, they had a project in the beginning of the 80s. It was called the One World Project. And during this, they had discussions on how can we put climate in this new Brundtland Commission report.
How could we shoehorn in our strategic goals?
How do we do it?
Yeah.
We give money to a couple of organizations.
I'm sure.
Yeah, of course. Environmental Defense Fund, World Resource Institute, and Woods Hole Institution, I think, and also they give money directly to the Brundtland Commission. And the state, we want climate change to be a part of this report. So they give money to a guy called Gordon Goodman. Gordon Goodman, he was the president of an institute here in Stockholm, the Bayer Institute, and it was more or less set up for these things. He's invited to report to write a report about energy. And in that report that is put into the Brundtland Commission final report, he puts in climate change agenda. And the money comes from Rockefeller Brothers Fund to do this. So and they state this. I mean, if you read all the background documents, they talk about this openly and how we should achieve this.
And that's a key point as well, Jakob. And I shouldn't have to say this, but for people watching, you know, conspiracy theorist and right-wing and anti-vax and all these terms have been skillfully built and developed into mega weapons to be used against anyone discussing the actual history and the facts that would allow people to realize we're being scammed on a gargantuan scale by really ultra-wealthy, nasty people. There's no conspiracy theory. But conspiracy theory is used, and I have people of intelligence who actually say to me, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. They will actually now, ordinary people, intelligent people, actually say, because something sounds like a conspiracy theory, this is how indoctrinated they are. They're not really interested in it. Even though it's the most important thing for them, their children and their grandchildren's future, beyond anything else in their universe, this stuff is more important. But they say it sounds like. Isn't it astonishing?
Yeah, the thing is, I mean, they got climate change into the Brundtland report. And at the same time, they were working to get the IPCC created. And that came in 1988. So we have a Brundtland Commission, 1987 comes out, and 88, the IPCC. And just after that, United Nations says, this is a global problem.
Yes, of course.
It's very, very important. I mean, and that changed a lot. Before we had the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the atomic bomb. That was one thing that they were discussing. We have to have, and they said this in the 40s, after the Second World War, we have to have a world government in order to stop a nuclear war. But this changed this because, I mean, the Soviet Union disappeared after a couple of years in the 1991? And so in came this new threat.
New enemy.
The new enemy. But that they had prepared for a long time. and they started to funding activists at that time to get opinion, but were demanding things. I mean, and it wasn't a big issue at the time, but it had started. And then they had this meeting in Rio de Janeiro with Maurice Strong. So Maurice Strong, in 1972, Secretary General of the environmental meeting, and then a part of this Brundtland Commission, and then he became the Secretary General of this Rio de Janeiro conference. That the outcome was the Agenda 21, and also the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So they started the negotiations about the climate. I mean, it just and I know some old climate scientists, but when this happened, it was so strange for them, because I mean, First of all, climate change and research about the climate and weather, it was they didn't have that much money. It was a few nerds that were involved in this, and suddenly it was just flooded in with money, and but also how fast it went from to get this. Everything was about human influence on climate. Not talking about natural causes and such stuff. And it went so fast, just a couple of years.
And to this day, or even more so recently, people will say it's all anthropomorphic, it's all man-made. Yeah. And the data, when I looked into it, putting anthropomorphic, even with the modelling, against natural variations and the kind of solar system cycles and the weather system and wind system and ocean cycles and natural changes, putting it in there, it almost gets lost in the noise. But it's all, like you say, it all came about man-made because that had been agreed 50 years before. There had to be a fear, it had to be executable, addressable, had to be a global problem with a global New World solution. And we see it all now today. And the 97%, you know, it registered there with me as well, Jakob. 97% of climate scientists agree. That is an absolute lie.
Yeah,
because the way, and the study has been debunked with a published study, the 97% kind of is that people agreed the climate does change somehow or another, right? Which should be 100%, actually. Yeah. When you get down to the ones that agree that it's mostly man-made and it is a severe outcome, right? I think you get down to something like 0.8% if you actually look. But they say 97% and they agree that we're in trouble and we need to do something and it's man-made. That figure is actually 0.8. So they're 2 orders of magnitude lying. Isn't that astonishing what they can do? But every person, including Strong, every person you're mentioning and every group links not peripherally, but intimately back into Rockefeller and into this history, essentially.
Yeah.
Is there any player of magnitude who does not have strong links that you can think of to the octopus?
No. I think it's impossible. You can't be someone in the world
be a player.
If you're not involved with this.
Yeah,
it's impossible. And Strong also, he was a part of World Economic Forum. We come to that because at the same time as the Brundtland Commission report came out, it became World Economic Forum, and Maurice Strong was there talking about this environmental topics has been discussed by the precursor first European Management Forum as early as 1973. They have a Club of Rome talking to them, and so it becomes a part of what they are we're working with. And Maurice Strong has been a part of, and Klaus Schwab, he states it himself. I mean, Maurice Strong was a very important person for this. So we can see this. We have this big environmentalism coming, and also these big players with the World Economic Forum at the same time, building up something.
And pandemics ultimately will arise as well.
Yes, because
global.
Yeah. And the thing is, Strong is very involved and he's working very closely with the Rockefeller network. And after this meeting in Rio de Janeiro, they are discussing, because in the new world system that they want to create, they want new values for a global society. So they want to agree on something that can be used. It's more like the new commandments for a new world. So, and this is interesting. It's actually the Dutch royals that commission the Earth Charter Commission to start, and they put Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev heading this. And their mission is to create this and discuss and talk to a lot of people all over the world to forge a consensus on these new values.
Consensus.
And but the thing is, they need someone must coordinate this work, and they ask Stephen Rockefeller. You can't make this up. Oh. So Stephen Rockefeller is Nelson Rockefeller's son. So, and he's a professor of religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of religion in this.
Yeah, a lot of religion in this. So they have meetings at the Pocantico Center at the Rockefeller Estate outside of New York, and that's where they decide this. And at the same time, they give money to a project, the Pole Star project, and it eventually evolves into the Global Scenario Group. They are kind of setting up scenarios for the future and discuss how can we create this new planetary society, this global regime, and so they have and they get money from the Rockefeller Foundation and also United Nations is involved in this, and we put up a report called the Great Transition, and we discuss in this report how could we get to the point where we have a world union, a world court, and a world regulatory authority, and all these, and create this sustainable utopia, more or less. Mm-hmm. And how do we achieve this? We have to, so we have a couple of scenarios for this, but we say to achieve this we need a global citizens movement that can come up with demands onto that want us to solve these problems with the climate and everything. So we come up with the advice to we have to fund this. The big foundations must be a part of this and fund a lot of activists and people that demand the changes that we need.
And that is, of course, AstroTurf.
Yeah,
fake grassroots.
Yeah, it is.
So I think people watching be very familiar with many examples, and there's a fantastic TED talk I might link. An investigative journalist lady gave a talk about all these fake grassroots organizations, and it's stunning. I don't know if you ever saw it. A lady in a red dress, 15-minute TED talk. I'll just link it because people can see it. This is the funding of AstroTurf or fake grassroots.
Corey Morningstar has written a lot about it. Wasn't Corey?
Corey, is she a lady, an American lady?
I think she's Canadian, but
possibly it is.
Yeah,
it rings a bell.
She's very good, and
yes,
so she has digged into it.
But sorry, let's go on. So
and the other thing was, but it wasn't. We also have to have triggers because crisis creates opportunities. And this we had discussed in the 70s as well, and of course it's an old concept. But we need crisis, because that's a way to change society. Yeah. So we discussed a couple of triggers for this big transformation to this new utopian society, and that was, one of them was the pandemic. A pandemic could be the big trigger, and we also had the climate, of course. Climate crisis and economic crisis and resource crisis with oil and so on. So that was the big thing. This global citizens movement, demanding things, and the triggers, the crisis, so that people see that if something is wrong in this world, we have to do things different.
Globally, with a new global control system, is
we have to manage,
not locally.
Yeah, we have to manage it globally.
Yeah,
it's always that way. Yeah. Never locally.
Never local.
Never, because there's only we talk about breakdown or breakthrough. And we said this in the Great Transition. I mean, if we don't do these things, the society will break down totally.
Disaster.
Meltdown. Catastrophe, everything.
Supposedly.
But if we chose wisdom, it will be paradise.
Utopia.
Yeah.
Utopia run by the ultra wealthy and all their minions. Beautiful, beautiful world. You know, that's something else occurred to me about the World Economic Forum. They have been so massively influential, but that thing about the pandemic being the big trigger, it truly was a trigger. It created horrific dystopia, mandates, anti-science became the new science. Every single thing in COVID was anti-scientific, essentially in the end, we know that. But it was a trigger for a massive splurge of all of their climate strategies. Transgender society atomization strategies have exploded. There's also a massive change in immigration. And again, we don't want to get into immigration in this discussion, but it has been many times identified as a way of breaking down nationalism. And I think Sutherland, that Irish guy who ran the United Nations, he made it clear we need to destroy we need to destroy sovereign nations to move European project forward, which I think is essentially the same thing. Does Peter Sutherland, he's a big banker. Yeah. That's a clue. I presume he has connections through to these other characters.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. So let's get back on the road now towards the 2000s. But I think we've covered some really useful stuff there. And sorry to the audience, but anyone at this stage who isn't beginning to realize that we've been gamed spectacularly by the richest, smartest people in the world, you know, really has no hope, because this is self-evident as we're describing it.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's very easy to check these things. I mean, you can just download the Brundtland Commission report. You can download these things with Agenda 21, the Earth Charter, and also the Great Transition. Everything is, just download it.
But it's also very much all documented to save you all the trouble of following up these tendrils in the book. So the link's below, the full horrific story. And everyone should know this story. If everyone in the world knew this story, our problems would finish.
Yeah, I think it's very, this is the most important story ever.
In the world.
Because it tells everything about how we have came this. This point.
And since March 2020, we're rapidly careening towards a horrific dystopian future, and no one even knows. If you know this story, even one read, you'll suddenly become someone who will counter this madness at every turn. But we need armies of people like so. So are we moving now into probably the 90s and heading towards kind of the 2000s? And what are the key events?
The thing is, we are in the 2000s, because this report, this report, The Great Transition, it comes out in 2002.
Gotcha.
Because they have decided that the 2000s is an important step to push things.
And 21 is 2021. They're aiming towards 2021. And then it became 2030 because they've made great progress with the COVID scam, but they've kind of nudged it forward. 2030 is going to be shocking what they plan to achieve by then.
Because, and this is the thing, Agenda 21, it's the whole. I mean, it's a century. But 2030 is just a step on the way. So before they have had this Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Millennium Goals that were decided in 2000. So this is just the steps on the way. So when we have when 2030 is finished, we will have 2045 probably. Right. So that's just parts of this transition, this transformation.
I actually mistakenly thought 21 was 2021, that there was a target to achieve a lot of this madness by 21, but now it slipped a little to 30. No, 21 is 21st century.
Yeah.
So 2030 is just a checkpoint, which they're heading towards with great velocity, as we see it with the madness all around us now and the loss of scientific rationalism all over, and the success of COVID. COVID was a huge success, probably beyond what they expected. COVID paid off for them spectacularly, didn't it? Kind of.
Kind of, but other things happen. I mean, it's a big risk for them to push this because a lot of people has started to react on this, and critical thinkers, what is happening here? So more and more people are actually coming together. So, and that's why I have to counter this with this. Very harsh methods and calling us names and everything. So, and that I think will only make more people suspicious that something's wrong.
Absolutely. There has been a form of inoculation of the public. I think around 70 or 80. For me in COVID, it was patently clear to me from day one, because of my history as a master technologist and my involvement with corruption in medical and nutritional world for 10 years, and my corporate background, I'm just not going to be scammed by something that's techno nonsense. And I knew in February, March 2020 this was nonsense, and I suspected it was going to be swine flu part 2. But it turned out swine flu was a dress rehearsal for the big one, which was COVID. But you know, there was probably around 10% who saw that it was nonsense and used the power of their own eyes, you know, empirical science of actually looking around you and knowing nothing was happening except in nursing homes. Around 10%. There was another 20%, I think, in the population that kind of knew something was a bit ridiculous, but they went along with it because they're getting to work from home and watch Netflix, and money is being printed and mouse click money is being generated and thrown at everyone, so it's fine. I think another 30%, we're not 100% sure, but they definitely went with it. And then there was around 30 or 40% of the population that actually embraced the nonsense and screeched at people to wear masks. I mean, God help those people. That is pathetic. But anyway, so so COVID. So we're moving up to the COVID era now, essentially, I guess.
Yeah, and the thing was happening, because now we get back to World Economic Forum again. Yeah. Because World Economic Forum, they weren't, I mean, I wrote a doctoral thesis, and in 2012 it came out. I mentioned the World Economic Forum one time in that. So at that time I didn't have a clue. They have a meeting in Davos. That was it. I didn't know. But something happened with World Economic Forum, and they have been working very meticulously to create, not just this organization that has a meeting for influential people. Now they decided that World Economic Forum would develop into a vehicle, a tool to achieve something, and an international organization for public-private partnerships.
Stakeholder capitalism.
Stakeholder capitalism, and working, and they also started this program, and this was early. It was in the 90s when I started to dig into this. I saw they have worked with this this program with the young global leaders, and it began in the 90s, and then in the early 2000s, they got this Young Global Leaders program, and they started to work on, discuss the coming problems. And at the same year as this program started, they also started the Global Risks Reports, 2004. And in them they could see this problem since on the horizon. We can help to manage these problems, and of course also earn some money on that as well. Crisis and opportunity. So it goes hand in hand. So at that time, World Economic Forum they're building the new organization after that, but it's finished, more or less finished, just before the agreement with the climate in Paris 2015, and also the agreement on the Agenda 2030 and the global goals. At that time, World Economic Forum becomes this new organization. And they have also put together working groups. I mean, the World Economic Forum is the members are the big corporations of the world. Yeah. So they have started a lot of working groups that are set to start to work on the international agenda and to solve evolving issues that's on the horizon. And among them is health, of course. They call these groups shaping the future of health or education, and every aspect you can find they have. So they are very, very well prepared when something is happening in the world.
They're immediately ready to exploit any and everything. And I think I'll show on the screen here the World Economic Forum kind of 2030, and it just shows a kind of a star diagram, a spider diagram, and you can keep clicking and go deeper and deeper. They have wrapped up the whole thing in every facet of modern geopolitics. They are all over it like a rash, as we say in Ireland. It's stunning. But of course, it all stems ultimately from Rockefeller and et al. And similar money over the last half century or more.
Yeah.
And here they are. And didn't they join up then with the other kind of axis of evil, if you will, the UN? They made a partnership.
A partnership just a few years later.
Yeah.
2019 in June, they had this agreement that the World Economic Forum would help United Nations achieving Agenda 2030, financing Agenda 2030, and also helping when the areas like climate change and health and education and gender and everything you can think of. And nobody, I mean, no media reported about this very, very important agreement.
Yeah. And you know, that's it. And that brings us beautifully, I think, into our fourth and final segment, because we wanted to focus very much on the future and what's coming and all these plans. We've seen they've done very well already.
Yeah.
We want to focus more on the United Nations, which is kind of a linchpin now of where the future is desired to be headed by these crazy guys, and the World Economic Forum. And the last comment I'll make maybe is just on the importance of what you mentioned, the Young Leaders Program in the late 90s. I believe Billy Gates, no less, was one of the first people on it. And also some other pretty key figures. But we know Ardern, New Zealand, Macron, France, Trudeau, Canada, and all of the worst, most horrific young, like basically dystopian.
Tony Blair was
early.
90s. Gordon Brown.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it just shows you the rich and powerful, they've achieved these enormous, incredible results, changing our whole world upside down. But it's not too surprising when you know that they've placed all the senior leaders and politicians that have driven this agenda, they've got in at the top all over the world. And as Klaus Schwab says himself, and I'll finish this clip with a clip from him, we have penetrated the cabinets.
Right. When I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are for our actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
Okay, guys, a fourth of four segments explaining to you all of the history of Rockefeller and all the other foundations and NGOs that have led us to where we are today. And in this fourth and final segment, we're going to go through the future. what these guys, they've been very successful over 100 years to get us to this kind of horrific point, in my mind. But we're going to talk about the UN specifically, and we're going to talk about the future they want for us. And I think that will leave people with knowing how important it is with your local politicians, with your friends or family, or however, grassroots, countering what's going on. So I'll let you go off, Dr. Nordangard, with maybe WEF UN, a bit more detail on the UN current reality, and but mainly where they want to go.
Yeah. The other thing is in United Nations and WF, they signed a partnership in 2019. This was the year we had a big climate meeting in New York, and a young Swedish girl sailed over the ocean. Greta arrived at the scene in New York.
And that's Greta Thunberg, I think.
Thunberg,
Western
Thunberg.
Greta Thunberg is how we pronounce it,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
you're saying it properly.
Yeah. So Greta came, and it was a big media thing, of course. And after that, United Nations. But the thing is, 2020, it was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. So it was a very important year for them. And they declared that this would be the decade of action, when things would happen. We have to achieve these goals that we have decided. And now they had a partner that was WEF. And we know what happened. It was a media frenzy over the climate, and then a couple of months later, we had the pandemic declared in March. Just a couple of months later, it was a big announcement by the WEF about the Great Reset.
It is obvious that we are in the midst of the most severe crisis the world has experienced since World War II. The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system. In short, we need a great reset. We have to mobilize all constituents of our global society to work together. We must not miss this unique window of opportunity.
The first speaker was Klaus Schwab. The second one was, interestingly, the now King Charles III, then Prince Charles.
You have a huge experience, and I know you can make a difference. So thank you for your involvement.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness, and I know want to thank you on another level, because I know you and Klaus Schwab will be sponsoring a series of Great Reset dialogues between now and the January 21.
And the third was Antonio Guterres.
Now we have the very special message from the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres.
I send you my warmest greetings and best wishes on the launch of the Great Reset. The COVID-19 pandemic is causing enormous human suffering and economic hardship. A microscopic virus has closed down entire countries and economies. Rebalancing investment, harnessing science and technology, and advancing the transition to net zero emissions, all elements of the Great Reset, are fundamental to building the future we need. Last week, the United Nations, together with the governments of Jamaica and Canada, convened the largest gathering of world leaders since the start of the pandemic to lay solid foundations for a sustainable recovery based on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement.
Declaring this is an opportunity to reset the system and make it more fit for the challenges of this century. And what happened after this was a couple of months later, United Nations had a meeting in September. They always had meetings in September. And that was about global governance. This had been prepared for a long time. But now it was a very, the crisis had hit, the pandemic, and the world was in shock. And so they say, now is the time to do something about it. So we had this summit, a virtual summit, of course, at that time. And they discussed how can we reform the United Nations, the UN system. And that was more or less the answer of the Great Reset for the United Nations. And the member states of the United Nations decided shortly after this meeting that we need to, we give the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he is commissioned to do a report about how we can make United Nations that's more fit for the challenges. 1 year later, our common agenda is released. And this is a proposal on the future. And it's a very futuristic agenda. And it's built very much on crisis management. I mean, it comes during the pandemic, and but they also say that we also have a lot of other crises, and you can follow this back to this the great transition that I talked about in the earlier episode, where we talk about crisis that will transform society to the promised paradise. We will have it's a situation that could be very hard for the nations of the world. So we need this management to cope with this. And this report, our common agenda, it has 12 commitments. It's commitments. 12 commitments to achieve the Agenda 2030. How can we do it? So we discuss, among others, a new social contract, where you as a citizen of the world is a lot about a world citizen, a global citizen. I mean, you have to, you are responsible for what's happening on this planet. And you have to be a part of solving these things. You are committed with this new social contract to solve the climate crisis. And also things that has to do with the pandemic.
So the citizens that were sovereign and national, we had all this beautiful diversity around the world and people traveled between all cultures. We now are all responsible as some kind of global pawns to help commit to fix the made-up nonsense crises that they've created. So think about that, guys. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
It is. So and one very big thing, very important thing in this among these commitments are that they want to create an emergency platform. So when an emergency hits, a crisis hits, that are global. The United Nations has beforehand put together a group of actors that will work with this crisis. And then you will have, of course, their partners, like WEF, big corporations, big foundations, civil society organizations, NGOs, the astroturfing,
banks and central banks.
Banks is very important. World Bank, IMF, and it's a very big part of this. So everyone should be prepared for a crisis, and they also will have protocols that tell them what to do in when the crisis hits. So, and they say this so that they work in unison. We don't want people that say that, okay, we can do this, it's wrong. No, everybody has to obey. We just have to follow these protocols to solve this problem. And they say that this platform, it will not be permanent, they say. So when we have solved the crisis, we will dissolve it. Oh. But if we haven't solved the crisis, we have to continue on. So now we want to put up a couple of these emergency platforms if a crisis hits. So it's a big part of this. And another thing that is very important is digitization. Because when you look into this report, it's a lot about to do with more or less creating a digital world brain. And it's also, this is the title of my latest book, The Digital World Brain. It will also be out in English. But the idea is to, in order to be prepared, preparedness is very important. You have to have data, and you have to collect data, and you have to collect data from everybody.
Yeah,
and they build an infrastructure to do this, and sort of creating a digital crystal ball where you can look into the future. And because if you get everyone's data and you put it, we call it the futures lab, and in this way they can see what kind of crisis we can see on the horizon, and this we might have to do something about. Yeah. And crisis can be, it can be people that don't comply and such things. So it's a very powerful tool and megalomaniac, I would say.
Oh, it's true dystopia, distilled true dystopia. It's almost, it really fits in a science fiction movie or a Minority Report with Tom Cruise. Yeah. So we see a crisis coming. So with COVID, we said there's a crisis, even though average age of death was in the 80s and the excess death from it was no different than a bad flu season. But at least the supposed crisis was going on. They told you, oh, look, it's terrible. They use the media. But now they could even say, we have modeled that a crisis will occur next year. Therefore, we need to start managing now and stopping people speaking and debating because this crisis is coming, a bit like the climate. It's a supposed modeled crisis. But that term, digital world brain, and the other terms there, which of those are actually their documented terms and which are you applying? Obviously, digital crystal ball, you're applying that term. But yes, the world brain, the other stuff?
The world brain idea, it comes from H.G. Wells.
Okay, so they're not technically saying that, but their documentation.
But if you read what we are supposed to do, it's, I have followed the ideas to this. And you can go back to the crystal ball, and we use crystal balls because that's what the powerful people also have wanted to do. They wanted to know the future. They want to know what people are going to do. And they are afraid of people, so they have to manage people.
Well, that's another huge thing that ties back to episode 3 of this, that the COVID madness achieved a lot for them. But as you rightly pointed out, it also woke up a lot of people to realize there's something seriously rotten in the world. And just when I'm saying rotten, Guterres, I mean, there are people who make my skin crawl when I just see them, and he's one of them, and obviously Gates and Co. are others, and Schwab. But it just shows you the human instinct is actually quite good.
Yeah,
but propaganda has caused it to fail. So, but
yeah.
Sorry, continue.
I must mention one thing with Gates, because we talk about is the global digital commons, a global digital compact. We want to create this, and when we talk about the digital commons, because we want everyone to be a part, technically connected to each other, to create this more or less world organism, but the thing is, we had a report done about digitization, but it's a backbone of this agenda. And this report about digitization, they chose to head this Melinda Gates and Jack Ma of the Alibaba Group.
Alibaba, the Chinese.
So we have Microsoft, more or less. And Alibaba, I mean, they created the social credit system in China. So we find these people put into, and they are the ones that come up with the ideas on how to do this.
Yeah.
So
and Gates as well. I guess the Microsoft kind of engine. Cloud engine is connected to this probably, and the ID 2020 that they actually had to edit mainstream interview with Bill Gates a few years ago, and I have the unedited copy. He basically admitted about ID 2020 that everyone would have to have it, and it'd have to be there, and you've no choice. And that was edited out of the interview because obviously that would wake people up and say, hold on a minute.
Yeah.
And like Reuters now, the power of the captured media, another Gates interview, he said, you don't have a choice. You're going to have to take the vaccine. People simply don't have a choice. And, you know, his hands are going everywhere. And Reuters fact-checked that. And that video gets you a ban on Facebook for just sharing an actual mainstream CNN or something interview and making a comment, because they say it's lacking context.
Yeah.
That he didn't just say you had to take it. He was saying, given the challenge of COVID, you have to take it. Like that made a difference. But sorry, to get back to it, Microsoft engine, cloud computing, mega computer power linked through to all the bad guys, and Melinda and Alibaba head of the social credit score, hugely powerful Chinese mogul, are all involved in this United Nations Western thing to go to a kind of a minority report power of predicting future crimes.
The future. And we talk about future generations. That's a big thing of this. How can we protect future generations?
Protect.
Yeah.
Safety.
And they also want to have an envoy for future generations. So a spokesperson will talk for people that are not even born yet.
Every totalitarian system in history, it was always for your safety.
Yeah, it is.
It's always,
Yeah,
and now they're even stealing from future generations, even though they're going to destroy the world and create a dystopian world for said future generations. They're actually stealing from those unborn people and speaking on their behalf to sell propaganda. You couldn't make it up.
Exactly.
So,
and one big thing is also information control.
Yes. Always.
Yeah. So they are more or less want to create a ministry of truth.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it's one of the commitments. It's all about information.
Yeah.
And how can we? Because Guterres said something about it. We must make lying wrong again.
Oh. He actually said that.
He said that, and it's just, but it's the opposite. I mean, it's all about controlling this, because they talk a lot about we have to involve people. We have to be so inclusive, and everyone should be a part of this. And we talk about consulting people, but there are things they don't want to hear. They don't want a critical person say, "I don't believe this climate change nonsense that you are propagating. I don't think this with the pandemic was right, or vaccines or whatever. You can't." Because they will, when you are sick, retarded,
extreme right,
racist. Everything, and they talk about they want to use behavioral design. So it's a lot of reports talking about how with behavioral science will make people do the right choices.
And all of what we saw with SAGE in the UK, the nudge units.
Yeah, nudging.
So they're actually documenting kind of all of their evil, but they're passing it off as, well, we want it for a good reason, like every totalitarian in history. We actually want to make, okay, there's going to be some freedoms lost and stuff, but we're going to give you something great in the end. And in the end, what comes is like Soviet Union or North Korea. That's what comes in the end. There is no exception to that rule until it's overturned. Whoa. Well, you know what? People, hopefully, a lot of people will watch this and just realize, along with parts 1, 2, and 3, that this is all documented. It's all on the record, though not easy to see because the media know what side their bread is buttered on and won't cover this because they know they will get smacked if they cover it. And individual journalists know there's certain things that if you cover them, your career will be stymied.
Yeah.
So they self-censor. They know that the owner of the newspaper doesn't like us talking about X, so they talk about nonsense Y instead. Yeah. And they get a raise then, and they can pay the mortgage, and they can, you know, fund their family. Is there anything else key then before we wrap up and do a couple of vignettes on some very hot topics that we're going to keep out of this? Any other things, or is that really the culmination of where we're heading based on all this history? People,
yes. Yeah. And I think it's very important with this, our common agenda, that people start looking into it. And because it's there, it's just to download and read, and it's coming out a lot of reports now this year. And next year we'll have this Summit of the Future. And that's a very, very important event. That's when we're going to decide, because we want to have a consensus document signed at that time by every member state of the United Nations, and they want to sign this pact for the future. For the future.
And you know, that just happens to be next year as well. The corrupt WHO, pharma organization, have the World Health Council and the pandemic treaty that takes away sovereignty from individual countries and puts it in their power to declare a pandemic. If some guy in India sneezes, technically they can declare, based on potential modeling, that we need now to cut our movements. It's shocking.
Yeah, and the WHO, I mean, that agenda, it fits into the emergency platform. That's
hand in glove. Perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah. So everything connects together. It's actually, as you said, Jakob, and I agree, and I said too, all of this stuff, when you actually have access, like we used to many decades ago, to news, you could actually easily put this together and see that it's an enormous scam of epic proportions, and it's threatening all our futures. The only reason you can't see all of this self-evident stuff is because the media don't cover it, but they were captured decades ago. So this book, I'm going to close with this, covers everything we talked about from the late kind of 19th century up until 2018, and your new
2020
book, or 2020, everything documented, all the references, if you want to bring this up with any individual and explain it to them, it's all in here. And the new book will cover the kind of from 20 going forward and the upcoming plans.
Yeah, that's the future agenda. I also have one book called Global Coup d'etat. That's about the pandemic and everything that happened during that time.
That's the COVID era in
exactly.
detail.
Yeah, that's the trigger.
Excellent. I'll put the links down below. And this was a pleasure, Dr. Nordangard, and fantastic. And we're gonna be following up later as these crazy things develop.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Really hope you enjoyed our premiere, and you know, there's been a lot of work I put into this to get all the slides in and video clips and everything else. More work possibly than any other video I've ever kind of produced. And of course, travel to Stockholm to meet personally with Dr. Nordangard to make this really special because of its incredible importance. I do need support with all these efforts, however, so huge thanks to my Patreon and PayPal and other supporters which keep this train on the track, and anyone else who can jump in and support in some way. And with the Patreon, you know, I run monthly Zoom meetings for certain levels and do vlogs and updates and unreleased material, etc. But whatever you can do to help, really appreciate it, and counter the corporate media, which, as you've seen from this production, are pretty much lathering us with nonsense from morning through till night. So thanks so much, guys.